Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Localis's policy webinar, Level Measures, Maximising Local Value, Placemaking, Budgets and Partnerships. I'm Jonathan Warren, Chief Executive of Localis. We have an expert panel to debate ways in which we might stabilise long-term delivery of local public services. The background to this is a report we published back in July at the LGA conference. Level Measures, a modern agenda for public service integration. The essay question we're seeking to ask here is simply, how well equipped, how well resourced are England's local authorities to navigate the twin tasks set before them of reforming local service provision and delivering successful placemaking over the short to medium term? Now, clearly we have a very turbulent time in local public finances. You can't avoid this. Back at our report Level Measures, two of the main recommendations we called upon were for reliable, long-term and consistent planning to unlock longer-term efficiencies, which we think you can get by planning provision over the long term. And secondly, in terms of doing the basics brilliantly, another policy recommendation was that councils should enjoy revenue support for their neighbourhood service provision, combined with money allocated through capital pots into a single placemaking budget. Now, very aware, nothing new under the sun here for people who've been around the houses with single regeneration budgets and all the like, but that's where we thought to take this. In terms of our just recapping Level Measures, we called for key recommendations a multi-year placemaking budget. Wouldn't it be nice to have a 5-year time span to plan service delivery and economic regen? Creating council-led placemaking boards with local partners and stakeholders to provide input into strategy and delivery. And as I said, going back to the recent past for the future, looking to re-establishing the kind of whole place pooled budgets as a universal standard. Looking into how we go about commissioning this, we also called for partnership frameworks with long-term strategic goals to maximise local value, so that we recommended councils working with the private and the third sectors in a relational, a strategic manner in which the priorities for residents were clearly spelled out, understood and delivered. So this is what we're looking at today in terms of Level Measures, placemaking, budgets and partnerships. Given where we are in terms of local finances and the macroeconomic picture, which will be more or less static public finances, how do we get the maximum long-term value from budgeting and the benefits of strategic and relational commissioning? So some of the questions I'll be asking our panel, I'll explain who they are shortly, to look at is, have we learned all there is to learn from recent and various attempts, single regeneration budgets and the like, to getting the most out of placemaking budgets and the potential they could offer for improved public service delivery? Given where we are, what would a good placemaking budget or budgeting look like in the current context? And what kind of tangible community benefits could be realised alongside service efficiencies? Given that the need to make the local pound stretch to its furthest, what opportunities might be offered through partnership working with the private and third sectors to generate the economic, the environmental and the social value benefits which councils and their communities truly desire? And what might be some of the obvious or not so obvious obstacles to achieving this? So that's what we're here to answer today. And I'm very grateful to have a top panel to help answer this. Starting up, we've got Andy Foster, Regional Director from Capita. In the following sequence, we'll have Rebecca Cox, the LGA's Local Government Association's Principal Policy Advisor. After Rebecca, we'll hear from the Chief Executive of Peterborough City Council, Matt Gladstone. And finally, on the budgeting side, we'll have Joanne Principal Advisor for Local Government at CIPFA. So the plan is, if I can ask my webinar colleagues to give your kind of answers in a couple of minutes each to where how you think we might go addressing the long-term issues of placemaking, budgeting, and relational commissioning. Once that's done, I'm going to throw out questions to our webinar attendees. If you could kindly lob your questions into the Q&A box, I will seek out the comments, but we prefer it in the Q&A box if we can, and we will continue the debate and dialogue until just before the hour mark is reached, if that sounds acceptable as the rules of the game. So, without any further ado, Andy, if I can invite you to make yourself ready and to give us your thoughts on how we ought to take this agenda. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, everyone. Lovely to see so many people tune in on a very autumnal feeling Wednesday morning. How do we solve 100 years of inequality in 2 minutes? I'm not sure I can do that one, so I won't even attempt. So, but I'll give a little bit of insight as to where we're coming from as a supplier, of course, to the marketplace, and some of my own personal views on where we go with it next. My role is I'm director within Capita's local government business. For those that don't know me, I know quite a lot of folks on the call. You'll see me in a travel lodge near you, flying up and down the country seeking insights. And the reason why we do that is to obviously become a better business, a better partner to you, but also to sponsor initiatives like this with Localis, to fire up insight, to create debate and create new thinking for everybody to use. And at a time when we've got a general election looming, there's no better time to discuss the matters of finance and local government service delivery. Just in terms of general thoughts on placemaking more generally, and dare I use the term sort of leveling up, that there is no silver bullet here. We have a low growth, high inflation, high taxation economy, and years of unequal economic settlements have given us the problem that we have now. So this is not a north-south division. This is not a north-south issue. This is across the country, where there's inequality everywhere. And of course, placemaking has attempts to address that at its very heart. But this is a long-term issue. And the first point I'll make is that it can't be resolved with short-term funding. So as we go up and down the country, I speak to a lot of our customers, and they fall into two camps, and they're either the bid ready or the not bid ready in terms of the next short cycle window of pitching in for government funding. And that seems a fundamentally unfair place to start. And even the bid ready, of course, as we know, do not get successful because of the opaqueness of the process, shall we say. Read National Audit Office for further details. But so that's the I would prefer to see a world where data drives allocation more so than perhaps how the politics of the land are lying at that time. The other point I recognise is, of course, that injections of capital funding bring with it themselves huge pressures on revenue budgets, and that's not always recognised. And anyone that was at LGA conference this summer would have heard Secretary of State Mr. Gove talk about perhaps a softening around some of the rules. So we might see a chink of light on the horizon in terms of the recognizing the pressure on revenue budgets from just capital projects themselves. But if we're in the process of releasing land for housing, building roads, building infrastructure, regenerating town centres, the built environment more generally, of course that brings huge pressures with it on already stretched frontline services like town planning, surveyors, architects, engineers, these kind of folks. And I'll finish my opening gambit with just a little reflection on other policies that have attempted to address regional inequality or national inequality. And the example we always kind of go to is, if we look at Germany and German reunification, in that particular example, that was a 30+ year program, maybe even longer, at which it required structural change, huge devolution, investment, consistent political commitment, macroeconomic policy that supported policy intent. And of course, in Germany, they spent 3% of GDP on regional inequalities and what we might call now leveling up, whereas the UK spent, I think, at the last look, about 0.1%. So it's too little, and it's not sure enough. So I'll finish by making my case for Perhaps an end to short-term competitive bid cycles, which are a distraction for excellent frontline professional local government officers. And whatever the model is in the future, it needs to be long enough to survive short-term, perhaps even longer than Parliament's, but 5 years is a good place to start, and it needs to be of sufficient size to make a real impact into the problems that we have across the country. Distribution should be decided by data as much as anything else, and recognise that capital injections bring with it their own pressures on revenue budgets, so that needs to be part of the solution.
Fantastic, Annie. Well, thank you for getting us off to such a strong start. I'm now going to invite Rebecca Cox, Principal Policy Advisor for the LGA, to share your views and reflections on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks so much for inviting me along. It's very much in our wheelhouse. So the LGA being the cross-party membership body for councils in England and Wales. Councils are the democratically elected leaders of place. They're the natural conveners, we would say, of course, but we think in reality as well, the natural leaders to do this work. And it's something that's very much on our minds as we go ahead into the next election. And if you forgive me a tiny plug, Jonathan, we're looking at doing a local government white paper to build on your excellent report and others. So watch out for more on that and the opportunity to feed in soon. You asked us the question, have we learned enough, or have we learned all there is to learn about this? And I started my career way back with Total Place and been through the various iterations. I would say that maybe in local government, we've learned a lot about that, and we're really ambitious to do it. One of the challenges is you've never made that case to government, partly because we've seen so much churn among the civil service, among ministers. We may have, sold to one group of people, but you're constantly making that argument over and over again, even to those people who are receptive. So something about the stability and the understanding of that national central relationship that will be fundamental, I think, to getting this right. Andrew mentioned some chinks of light, and I had exactly the same phrase, or maybe call them slightly open doors. So where are those kind of points of hope for us looking forward? One is around the trailblazer deals that some of the combined authority areas have signed. That won't work everywhere, but there's some really positive things I think we can take about government's willingness to at least try this in some places, and hope that that's a shared commitment across the national parties going into whoever the next government might be. And there's something that the LGA, I think, can do to step into telling the story. What does that look like in non-devolved areas? Because doing that as a deal-by-deal system doesn't really feel sustainable either for local government or for the civil service in terms of capacity. The change and the ending of funding for LEPs and the move to local government, we maybe wouldn't have chosen to do it this way in this timescale and exactly this model. Nevertheless, there is something for us to work with there about bringing that back into local government, as long as there's funding to go alongside it. It starts to give a way to think again about that partnership with business. Funding simplification plan sounds very dull. It was promised in the Levelling Up white paper, but was announced in the summer. So there's some piloting, which is really positive, but actually within that announcement, there's a commitment to a new funding simplification doctrine. And if that can be a driving force for moving away from competitive bidding and to bring together some of these pots to move to a more sort of allocation model, I think if we can keep the momentum up behind that, that could be a lever to help more of Whitehall understand how to work with local government in a different way, as we still work, obviously, to get those much longer term budgets in place. So I think there's something for us to work on there. And then coming back to where I started, I suppose, the election, we will all be putting across the message, won't we, of the importance of local public services, different ways of funding, lots of immediate pressures that local government needs addressing, but also to lay the foundations for some longer term change. And it was really interesting talking to colleagues in COSLA in the summer, so Scottish Council's organisation, about the new agreement they've signed in Scotland with their government. Obviously years of hard work and making the case and all of that. But also I think what turned it for them was just having someone to talk to, the right minister who was up for it, who really was committed to it, and First Minister as well, and just being able to really move forward at pace when the moment is right. So there's something for us to do, I think, not just to keep making that case with all the evidence that we'll gather and continue to make, but also to jump on those changes of relationships where they occur and really kind of cement as much as we can within that. So lots of possibilities. That that all has to be framed, I think, in the very real challenges that Matt and all his colleagues across the country are dealing with right now. You've also got to have some capacity locally to be able to do this when you're just trying to keep the lights on and keep, people cared for in housing that's, safe and warm and right for, and all of those really real things as well. So I think the more that we can join up across the sector to share our capacity and keep making this case with stakeholders across the piece, I think the more successful we'll be. Thanks.
Rebecca, many thanks indeed for those excellent comments. And we're going to move swiftly on to Matt Gladstone, Chief Executive at Peterborough City Council. In fact, you joined us when we were talking about this as an MJ Future Forum South. Matt, so many thanks for that. What's your take on where we are and where we possibly might like to go in regards to placemaking budgeting?
Thanks, Jonathan. Really delighted to be here, and I suppose I want to give you a personal flavour within Peterborough, I suppose, around what we're facing and the challenges. So interesting is Peterborough, we are, I think, the second fastest growing city in the country. So we're blessed with a huge amount of economic growth, aspiration, lots of opportunity, but we do have significant financial constraints as an organisation, like many across the country. But I suppose 4 things I wanted to just flag up. One is around, actually, I think it's really important that we ask the public. So we've got a budget simulator that we are rolling out for the second time now, and we've adapted and tweaked it quite a bit, but it's actually giving people a sense of actually these are the challenges that we face and actually giving them some choices. And I think we're going to do that in a much more engaging way over the next 6 weeks with a whole range of different community groups, businesses. I had a big sort of ask the chief exec leader youth council session, but we had about 100 students in the university. Great opportunity to get their view and perspective around sort of place, the city, opportunity. So I think consultation and engagement on an ongoing basis, I think, is absolutely critical. I think the second point for me is around, there's a lot of focus around the capital, levelling up monies. Don't get me wrong, hugely helpful. I've got a new university underway that opened last year. I've got huge growth plans happening on the back of that. That stimulus from that capital investment that has pumped prime by central government has been absolutely key, combined with private sector, further education, HE sector investment as well is really important. I've got a station quarter, new station planned, £300 or £400 million scheme around growth, completely going to change the look and feel of Peterborough as you arrive, access the parts of the city. So the Trailblazer deals, I think, is quite an interesting concept. It seems as if it's a bit of a pick and choose. What do you want? And I think you need to be understanding around what do you really need for the city and the region. But we are engaged with government on those, and I think that's really helpful. Changing government potentially, levelling up doesn't seem to be a big high profile potentially with the Labour government. So it's not highlighted that much. So I did be interested to see what happens longer term around sort of levelling up, regen, the nature of the high street, how we protect parks, open spaces, etc. So I do think, from my experience, the relationship with central government is really key, irrespective of what party, is that engagement around opportunities, discussions. And I think where you proactively engage as councils, it plays dividends. The third area for me, I feel, looking ahead of the next sort of 3 to 5 years, is as local government, we're having to fundamentally look at what's our role. Yes, we have lots and lots of statutory issues to contend with, but I genuinely feel when I go out and about across the city around place shaping, there is a multitude of organisations doing similar sort of stuff. So if I look at, I met a charity the other week around early help. It's a charity. I've got an early help team doing similar sort of stuff. There's still some duplication in the system, I think. And these are teams which are on the ground, working in our open spaces, working with our young people out and about across the city, working on things like mental health, drugs, alcohol, etc. Same around how our clean, green neighbourhood type services, there's opportunities of really rethinking how do we deliver that and how do we sustain that, and do question mark, even for councils, do we have to do that at all in some areas? Can other organisations tackle things like biodiversity in probably a much better way than we can as councils? So I think we have to be much more alive to how we do that at a very localised level and at a strategic level. And in particular, nobody's mentioned it, but councillors, it's about educating councillors of being more receptive to new ways of working. They can be a bit like, well, but I still want that street to be cleansed on a regular basis, and I still need that money to go in. It's just we haven't got that luxury anymore. I'm dealing with huge children's pressures, energy, inflation, and actually it's really, really hard to protect some of those more traditional community-based services, neighbourhood-based services, because the social care pressures are really kicking in now. So my last point around finances is the need for transformation. I like the idea of people are talking a little bit around that total place concept again. But for me, it's about a different model, doing different things across the sector, across what government, across the city. And I think lots of councils are really struggling with this, as we keep seeing of umpteen different councils going into Section 114 territory. There must be a good 30 or 40 councils out there, from my understanding with DLUC, that are struggling. But I think we need a different skill set to properly understand how do I really transform these services going forward, and looking at really challenging hard what's the role of the council, particularly around regeneration, community-based services, and enabling other sectors to step in and do that, and we facilitate and enable rather than sometimes direct delivery. And it's if I'm honest, my experience is it's quite complex. And if we can try and simplify that, that's a trick as leaders. I think that's really important. So there, Jonathan, just a few thoughts from me for sort of a little bit of reflection, but that look ahead piece as well.
Matt, that was terrific. Many thanks for sharing your recent experience with Peterborough and your long-term thoughts on this. So our final panelist is Joanne Pitt, Local Government Principal Policy Advisor at CITFA. Obviously, there's quite a lot going on in local government finances in the broader spectrum. When it comes to placemaking, budgeting and commissioning, what do you think is most important going forwards from what we're talking about today?
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate the invite to talk about something which is really important if we're to ensure that local government has some stability going forward. We really need to look to solving some of the problems. As you said in your introduction, I'm from CITFA. So CITFA is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountants. So we are the membership body for the accounting profession for the public sector, sort of aimed and focused around good, strong financial management. In the past, we've considered the concept of place-based budgeting, because it's not, as you said in your introduction, not something that is particularly new. It's been on the radar for a number of years. Obviously, we've had some significant policy reflections and in things like the Total Place from 2009 and then even sort of the No Stone Unturned documents in sort of 2012. So it's 10 years on, we are able to accept that it's a good concept, but it's actually how do we take what is good from a policy point of view and in theory into something that is much more practical as we go forward. Because the concept, I mean, first of all, even if you think about the wording of place, what is place to people? We talk about place-based budgeting, or and that's right at the very word. What does that actually mean? Does that mean a council space? Is that a sub-regional space? Is it an area of connectivity? So Yeah, so that first definition and scope is actually harder than people tend to imagine, because people work, and where they live and where they spend their leisure time is sort of brought in, as Matt quite rightly talked about, the experience of the customer, which should be at the heart. That customer journey should be at the heart of the budget. But I suppose, coming from an accounting point of view, I was going to sort of make a couple of sort of practical observations on the challenges and around place-based budgeting that we've identified. They're not insurmountable, but I think that they are often much more difficult than people would initially consider them to be. So, for example, I think some of the barriers that you're looking at are the sort of legislative barriers, where you talk about place-based, and let's say, for example, probably the most recent example in that area is the ICS's concept, but you've still got barriers between sort of budgeting cycles, terminology, goals and objectives. So those things that sit in the background can provide some real problems when we come to looking at what we would call sort of place-based budgeting. And I think that when you sort of look at the amount of work that needs to go on to place-based budgeting, I again think it might have been Rebecca who talked about capacity, and it certainly can't be done without significant investment, because it really does involve such a broad spread of people with different goals, different challenges. And so I think we'd sort of, maybe there's a list of things that I would think would stand quite well for sort of consideration on that place-based budgeting approach. I think you need to understand the policy landscape and understand what drives policy, because policy from Whitehall is not often supportive, and can sometimes be challenging when you start to think about place-based initiatives. You can't underestimate the governance when you're looking towards place-based. That is absolutely key, because that sort of drills down into concepts of accountability and assurance. So we need to be really, really aware of how that is done and driven practically, who's accountable for what. That's particularly important when you're talking about blending budgets. Because the idea of place-based, you're bringing together budgets for the greater good, individuals, and for looking at outcomes. And particularly when local authorities and other public sector organisations are pressed for money, that concept of budgets and pooling them together can become quite, challenging. You also need to understand the totality of the funding. So right from the start, how much money have we got in the system? Might seem quite a simple position, but actually that's quite a difficult one, because if we're looking at place-based budgeting to drive and bring about improvements, then we need to know how much money there is in the system that we've got to play with. What's the totality of that? Leadership and strategy is essential, because if the leaders are not working together with clear strategy, you can't, the budget will never support something because it's not clear as part of that. And then I think the last two I would finish with is that we need to develop the capacity across the board to support this new initiative, and that sort of underpins the very practical examples of targets, goals, and the financial management that sits under that. So that includes very dull things, but it does include things like reporting, so we can get that structure right, and that shows how well a place-based approach can deliver on outcomes rather than sort of outputs. So I think that would be my sort of, I suppose, quite practical point of view from the budgeting thing. But I think we've learned there's lots of good examples out there, and we can take some of that and learn that and use that at a larger scale.
Many thanks indeed, Joanne, and many thanks to all our panelists, Andy, Rebecca, and Matt, also for getting us off to a start. So look, we've got another sort of 25 minutes, I'd say, to play with, to talk further through on the issues. Anyone who wants to throw their question or comment, please, we have the Q&A box in there. To get us started off, Andy, I thought it was very interesting you talking about the need for long-term structures and certainty, something which certainly is bedeviled sort of any term of long-term plans over things like growth, industrial strategy, LEPs. In recent cases, you made the example of how after German reunification, trillions were poured into the East German economy under a long-term plan, and now, lo and behold, there isn't. I think I'm correct in saying there isn't a single land or part of the former East Germany that isn't more prosperous as they're anywhere in England, which is quite telling. Going back to clearly we've been bedeviled by lack of stability, shifting and changing, as well as complexity. I guess where you have relationships built on trust and good relationships, that sort of takes a lot of tension, takes a lot of friction, and provides a lot more efficient transfer of funds from centre to locality. And as Rebecca mentioned, we have the examples of the trailblazer deals, Greater Manchester and West Midlands and other parts of the country looking forward to that. If we were to, how would we like to, though, obviously, Rebecca, I'll give you first refusal on this. But in terms of any thoughts about how, given what we have now, what would a universal, almost simplification look like? And then realise that we were managing different layers of complexity, but it's in terms of providing there's a lot more trust between centre and locality to get ahead with programmes. And what do you think might be realistic going up until say the end of the decade, 2030, where a lot's hanging on? How could we maybe streamline and simplify, and what would be necessary both sides of the equation, from Whitehall as well as local government, to lubricate that simplification? Any thoughts?
That's quite a big question, isn't it, to start off with? I'll answer some parts of it, I suppose. So one of the things we've thought about in the past here at the LGA is a baseline for this. So what is kind of almost the bare minimum of things that we would want to see available to local government to take on? And that's powers, responsibilities, funding, all kind of wrapped up. The white paper, the Levelling Up white paper, went some way to doing some of that in a kind of small way. But I think limited by, and I think they'd say this themselves, limited by DLUHC's ability to bring the rest of Whitehall on board. So I think all of this is kind of contingent on a real will across ministers, across civil servants, to say, we can do this differently. Let's step back and think, actually, what could be local by default? What does local government now have the capacity to do? What might we see as a pipeline going forward? And I think I really, really enjoyed Joanne's really practical challenges back of how would you do this? And one of the things, for example, in the trailblazers is, I think, an interesting take on what accountability might look like around that, with MPs being involved. So if we're bringing budgets and responsibilities together, I think we can't not have that conversation amongst ourselves locally of how can we we might feel we've already running £1 billion budgets, that's kind of enough, but we know it's not practically, in having that conversation with national government. So what are the things that we could offer that would assure national government ministers, in the short term at least, that this will be well managed money that will be delivering good outcomes? So I think some thinking collectively about what are those governance structures that will support some of that would be really helpful.
So the sort of regional pacts might not be the worst answer here in terms of guaranteeing that accountability. Anyone else like to come in on?
Jonathan, I wonder if I might just throw in a couple of thoughts here. So, look, I think one of the challenges with the short-termist solution that we've been seeing with short-term pots of cash, which are vastly oversubscribed, and then interestingly vastly under withdrawn, is that it drives you to quick fixes, perhaps low-hanging fruit, or projects, in the infrastructure sense, the built environment sense, projects that are already quite well developed. They're shovel ready, as we might call them, and the problem is that they're already well thought through, and it doesn't add too much addition. It's very welcome funding, but it isn't really addressing some of the key issues, perhaps the more difficult issues, and therein probably lies the problem. So whatever the answer is, it has to be long term. It has to outstrip a couple of parliamentary cycles, and I was really interested in that, in the points that have been introduced by fellow panelists around what kind of, I think Matt introduced this, what kind of council do we want to be, and to what extent does our journey, if I'm part of a council, what part does my responsibility stop, and then what part am I comfortable handing over to charities, business communities, or others? And I'm really kind of interested in what barriers might exist to knock those down. But whatever the answer is in terms of the original question, kind of it has to be long term, and it has to be met with a vision that both business community and government leaders all stand behind, and the best place for that is those that live in the place. So I'm obviously a pro devolutionist, but the point of that is why I believe that local people are more likely to drive good outcomes, is because they care about their place more than anybody else, and fundamentally it comes down to those emotions and those emotional buy-ins. So long-term, local people know their place well, and yes, there are lots of barriers getting in the way here, some legal, some politics, some other issues, but I think if we can find a common strand, a common point of vision, then the rest of the things can be worked through.
Jonathan, can I come in there? Yeah. I just picking up on those points. I think that Andy makes are, where we can work in partnership with, the third sector or other people. But I think there is that discussion that needs to remain about what is the local authority's own responsibility. So whilst they can allow somebody to deliver it, if there is a failure of that delivery, where does that ultimate responsibility to sit? And I think this sort of opens up something that Matt was alluding to about about local government's role, and probably coming back to the statutory services that local government provides, and how they will be able to manage to provide those, and is there flexibility in this discussion to look at some of those, and should local government be delivering, as you said, Matt, should local government be delivering all of those things that they currently are required to do? Because if we start to look at the sort of shifting within a sort of more place-based approach, there's a sort of level of people actually doing the job, and then that's coming back to sort of, I suppose, the previous point I've made about then who's accountable if it goes wrong, and where does that sit? And I think that's a different dynamic for place-based. Sometimes it's easier easy to allow people to take over a role, such as maybe a third sector. But if something happens, who is ultimately accountable within this place-based approach?
Okay, so where the buck ultimately stops in terms of responsibility for provision, that thing. Matt, would you like to come into that? You were talking about kind of reimagining the role, the necessary reimagining of the role of local government. Any sort of further thoughts on that and what we've heard in the previous comments?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all the comments made around the need for longer term funding, etc. But I think my experience is that you need to be ready with a pipeline of schemes and ideas. Don't sit back and wait for government to come along and say, here's 20 million quid and give us your thoughts. We know the place best. We need to understand that. We might need some help to develop that thinking. But I also need to bear in mind, we live in a political system, whether that's local councillors, MPs. It's quite a volatile area at the moment around politics and general election coming up. So actually, we need to be open-minded, but they are looking for quick wins as well. So they want to see the shovel-ready schemes. I mean, even if you're a mayor of a combined authority, they're elected for 4 years or whatever, and I need to see change. I need to see impact. Otherwise, they won't be the mayor in 4 years' time. So I think that's a tricky area. And somebody's made a link with the ICBs and the integrated care systems. There was that, what was it, the Hewitt review talking about, can we shift 1% of funding into prevention? You think, crikey, 1%? Why can't it be 5 or 10%? But even 1% seems to be a real challenge. But that should be around the place shaping stuff. And I think local people are still, they sort of live in the immediate time because they look at, is this place clean? Are there good events? What's the culture offer like? Arts, all that softer stuff. But actually it's so important as a place. And all I'm questioning is, we don't have statutory responsibilities for some of that. And even on some of that where we do, I'd still question, do we need to be directly leading and delivering that? And I think there's a role for the sort of LGA and others to sort of help to think, how do we really transform what local government does? And it always feels to me at times, and I've worked in central government, private sector, but we are called local government. We are the front-facing bit of government, but it doesn't always feel like that. It feels like a sort of, there's hundreds of different councils. They all do it very differently. And central government doesn't understand what we do. But we actually are the front-facing bit of place leadership, that enabling role, whether it's linking with DWP, skills. It's a very mixed field. But actually, on some of it, we don't actually deliver a huge amount. And there's a real misconception about what councils do, but where I think we can get it right, if you can really deliver some benefits, longer term thinking and aspiration and ambition for the place, I think that's amazing. And in my view, it's probably one of the most exciting jobs going, because it is firsthand, you make a difference on the ground. But I think we need to be open and more transparent around decision making, but also, how do we do it differently? And I think we need a huge amount of skill sets. Somebody put in the Birmingham one. But there's lots of councils there. They are generally really struggling. Because they haven't got the capacity and they haven't got the skill set. And the decision making, unfortunately, by some of the councillors has been found wanting.
Many thanks, Matt. Well, let's
Jonathan, I wonder if I just add a final thought to that strand. And it's really interesting debate, because of course, if you have third sector suppliers or charities or business groups or other kind of community groups prepared to take on some of these roles, that's fine on a informal can we help kind of basis. But the minute the council acts as perhaps more of a formal commissioner and says, this is a package of work or package of outcomes, go and deliver it, please, we're happy you do it, effectively it changes the dynamic. And I wonder how many charities or third sector groups might kind of walk away from the magnitude of that accountability. So it's an interesting point. But I sit on a board in the Northeast, the Business in the Community group, which is kind of businesses coming together trying to do good things. And we one of our strands in our particular pipeline of work is around place, and we've done some great stuff in Blackpool, Coventry, Bradford, and a few other places. But often I was surprised at quite how hard it is to elbow your way into a kind of a place-based conversation with local authorities and community leaders, in the sense that, so I'm making the point here that the business community and possibly other segments of the third sector are untapped energy that could be brought into the conversation. Now, although there's a lot of local place-based boards and they're doing the right thing, but I still think there's a lot of untapped resource and untapped energy that can be brought as part of this, to drive outcomes.
Many thanks, Annie, for that point on bringing in sort of latent place potential. Okay, I think we can dip into the Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes left. Stephen Robinson asked Joanne or anyone, do we have any examples of projects, service areas from people's experience where budgets have been pulled for successful outcomes? Do we have any nice flare paths to illuminate the path for success in placemaking budgeting?
Yeah, I think that there is successes that we can see out there. There's examples sort of from Manchester. It was one off the top of my head. I mean, there's not a plug, but SITFA itself did some work called Aligning Local Public Services. So that is on our website. It was a few years old now, but actually it was all about aligning budgets and there was a toolkit to go with it. So that had links to examples as well. So I do think that there are a lot of good examples out there. I would say, and I don't think this is purely for place-based budgeting, I sometimes think that local government is not as good to celebrate its successes as sometimes the noise about failures comes through on in the media. So there are successes for place-based budgeting. But there's also a lot of examples that identify some of those challenges that I sort of talked about earlier on in the opening session, and those I think those still exist in all the scenarios. And sometimes where the good examples work, it also comes down to relationships, which is quite often one of the keys to the success of all of these things, not just place-based budgeting, but a lot of things like this, which is that sort of shared level of honesty and a good relationship between those involved. And then that provides the strong foundation for the more the more business side, like the sort of governance and everything, but it's always based on that strong level of good relationships. But no, so yeah, so aligning local public services, there's good examples in Manchester, and the document has those, and so hopefully that's a little bit of background reading.
Many thanks, Joanne. I put it in the chat channel, the link for anyone who wants to grab it. Any more good story examples before we go to the final question and take it down a notch onto S114s? And Andy, would you like to come in?
I'll just say a couple of things on that. I mean, I'd answer the question slightly differently, which is, show me a place and I'll show you that the local authorities and community leaders have come together to create outcomes. It'd be very rare. And Peterborough, I'm sure in Matt's back garden wouldn't ever be growing at the pace it is if it had just been the council working in a silo. It just doesn't happen like that. I think there are success stories everywhere. We just don't always shout from the rooftops, as quite rightly said. I was going to make a slightly wider point about coming at it from a private sector provider. I'm delighted to see the trend in, coming back to public tenders here, the kind of prosaic world of public tendering, but starting to see the trend in the increasing weight on social value, which kind of forces private organizations like myself to think differently. It's no longer a tick in the box for us in terms of what good are we going to do as a result of this, and it's now become front and center. And whilst that gives my colleagues in our bidding teams a big headache, I think it's for the good, for the greater good. And I think about some of the contracts we've entered into, and I won't name names. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say or not, but there are some contracts where we have signed up to what I would call super KPIs. So these are cross-cutting community outcomes where we are just as much on the hook for them as anybody else. So these are things like small and medium-sized enterprise survival rates, unemployment in the borough, housing delivery. These are things that are not quite totally directly related to the contract itself, but we are brought in as a provider because we have the energy and we can have some people and we can contribute to the agenda. So we're sort of saying, well, if you give us some of those levers, we will make commitments to positively contribute to these cross-cutting community issues. And I think that's to be applauded, and it's only going to do us all good.
Many thanks, Andy. Well, I'm going to put Rebecca. You want to come in?
Sorry, just really briefly, because I'm
Please.
conscious we're short of time, but just to pick up a couple of things that others said around, sometimes it's just looking through a slightly different lens to understand what budget pooling or kind of shared working might be. And we did a look back at 20 years, and we could have gone back further, of place pilots, which I think was stole a really good phrase from one of our interviewees, which was a trend of bolt on, roll out, move on. But coming back to Matt's point, where they were most successful is when you're not trying to do it as a standalone project, but there's a really deeply shared vision of what you are trying to achieve in your place that all partners have signed up to. And that any funding that comes your way or any opportunities to pilot some of this work, you can just grab that and kind of work it into that work program we've already got going on. But that does also depend on the strengths of relationships. And that's a dynamic thing that you always have to constantly be working on, because people change, people move on, politics might change. All of that is something that needs a long-term kind of personal investment from the leaders in place. Lots of other findings as well. It's on our website if you want to have a look at some other examples of where people have tried this in different ways through the last couple of decades, which makes me feel quite old.
Well, many thanks. We'll signpost those links in our letter to all our registrants later. Now we've got 5 minutes left, and I think we owe it to ourselves. We have to be topical, realise the sensitivities involved. But now Ade Fashade asked a very pertinent question. Can we have sort of concluding views about the situation at Birmingham City Council? It's national, it's international news with commissioners coming in. He asks, is it the sign of things to come? And does it pose a threat to devolution as we know it? If there's more coming along, we'll be certainly at Localis, we'll be at the Lib Dem, Conservative Party and Labour Party conference talking about this very issue in the coming weeks. But from the panelists here, do quick final views. In terms of talking here about placemaking, budgeting, but local government finance in general, how much of a risk do we see at the moment? Matt, would you like to come in first?
Yeah. I mean, we've obviously found ourselves on that risk category a couple of years ago. So we were on the first rung of government intervention. We're due to come out fairly shortly, but my experience from discussion with DLUC is that there's several councils in this camp. I'm not surprised by the government stance on Birmingham, if I'm honest. I think they need to be seen to be acting swiftly. It's quite interventionist in style, obviously, and there are a range of different areas of how we approach that. We've worked very closely with CIPFA, we've worked closely with LGA, we've got a voluntary improvement panel. It's been a really good model, if I'm honest, around how we shape that. They check and challenge constructively our work, but I think it's been a very, very good model. But I think you need to tailor it according to the needs and issues that you're dealing with within each council. Some of the reports I've read have been absolute horror stories, if I'm honest, and you think, really, has it really happened? Is it really that bad? But you think, well, it probably has. And I think, if I'm honest, I think the sector has lost its way a little bit. And I think the development around best value standards and that assessment, I think, is desperately needed. I speak as a new chief executive, and if I'm honest, there was very little training given to me as stepping up in as a chief executive. And I compare that, if you were a chief constable or whatever, you'd have gone through a command course. So it feels local government hasn't quite nailed that in terms of whether it's Solace, LGA and others. What does that golden triangle look like for your monitoring officer, your 151, etc.? And it's absolutely critical to get that relationship right. And I think because the sector has been cut back, you know, and I was at a conference last week, lots of the places have said it's been like that for years. All the signals were there, but audits haven't happened across our arrangements for the last 2 years. So I think there's been some real gaps in our governance arrangements as a sector has been pretty poor, if I'm honest. Not in all cases at all, but I think there will be a number of councils, they are for assessment, governance, standards, performance in particular. And I actually welcome the stuff around potentially slightly mixed views around off-log, but best value standards, and so around LGA, around that sector-led improvement bit and relationship with government, I think is key.
Many thanks. Well, coming up against the rail, can I ask very, very brief comments from Andy, Rebecca, Joanne, in that order, just on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just final thoughts from me. Look, I won't profess an opinion on what's happening to colleagues in Brum, but it does quite rightly raise a wider issue about why is the intervention always when it's too late? And I'm sure town halls and Whitehall have been discussing long before it, but it does raise, as Matt quite rightly says, this issue of what is the role of data in this? What is the role of off-log? And could we see a world where we're not measuring just outputs from local authorities? That's interesting, but it's not ultimately valuable. What is interesting is perhaps using it as an early warning sign for those authorities that are in some kind of financial distress or about on the cusp of financial distress, and therefore intervention or package of support can happen at a much earlier stage. Whatever the answer, you know, I personally believe the sector is stronger for all constituent parts of it, whether we are talking from a business perspective, a supplier's perspective, or a local authority perspective, or a community perspective. We need to keep talking. The model we have at the minute isn't perfect, but we can use this pre-election period to get ministers and their manifestos listening.
Many thanks, Andy. Rebecca, final thoughts from you, please.
Thank you. And I mean, I similarly won't venture an opinion on Birmingham specifically. Obviously, sure, supporting councils across the piece is a key part of what the LGA does, and colleagues are out there working really hard on this all the time. There's always more we can do. We're trying to talk to Offlog a lot to try and be collaborative in how that data piece can support the sector in a useful way and in a supportive way, in a constructive way, and we'll keep pushing in that direction as well. I think the worry for the sector, and I guess what keeps some of us awake at night, is when you start to see those 114 notices being issued for what you might kind of call a well-run council, right? They're doing everything right, but they just run out of money, and that's, you know, once people start to go into that place, it can be very hard to come back, I think. So just a bit more money would be incredibly welcome.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And Joanne, final thoughts and reflections from you, please. Or not, as the case may be. Rebecca, you could... So Joanne... Okay, well, in which case, I'm going to have to call an end to proceedings. We're going back to total place, whole place. I remember famously when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he'd end proceedings either one of two ways: either the biblical injunction, "Go forth and multiply," or the Looney Tunes ending, "That's all, folks." I'm not sure which one of those two I'll do, but I will certainly thank all our great panelists today: Andy, Rebecca, Matt, and Joanne. Thank you so much for contributing to our debate. Thank you everyone who signed up to join the webinar. Joanne, final word from you quickly. You've got. If you can unmute you. No, I think I'm going to end it there. That's all, folks, for real. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll keep in touch. And thank you for joining in our debate today. Thanks for everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.